Hello and welcome to another edition of Professor Speaks. My name is Alex Hernandez. Alongside me, as always, is Dr. Craig Stern. And today we're going to be talking about drug waste. In the news, we have heard senators, both Democratic and Republican, speaking about one of the major contributors to high drug prices is drug waste. So here to help us understand what drug waste is Dr. Craig Stern. Now, you have worked in a clinical setting before and administered drugs before. So can you tell us what exactly is drug waste?
Yeah, you're right.
Mhm.
I did work for decades in hospitals
Don't
and
date
some in
yourself.
retail. I'm very young. So, um, um, drug waste technically is where, in an ambulatory setting, somebody doesn't take their entire prescription.
Okay.
In a hospital setting, it means that someone had a vial of medication and only part of it was used.
Okay.
Now, you don't see a lot of it. In fact, the argument generally is that, and I understand in some of the things that the staff came up with, that was knocking drug companies over setting up vial sizes for drug waste.
Right.
But at the end of the day, most of the effort is based on selling more product, more vials, rather than trying to get a bigger dose or more money out of it, et cetera,
Right.
because the drug costs have risen regardless of what the vial sizes were. And typically, on the hospital size, vial sizes were set to correspond to the approximate dose that you would give to an individual. Now, obviously, that changes. If you have drugs like in cancer chemotherapy, certain cardiac drugs, et cetera, where you do it based on body weight, then
Right.
you can use a portion of that. And we, in our work, in what we've done with our specialty analyses, as well as analyzing for multiple physician groups and others plans, what goes on in waste. We have seen it, not very often, but we have seen it in areas where, for example, and only as an example, physicians have bought a vial of influenza vaccine. They've given a dose, which is usually half a cc, but they bought a 10 cc vial,
Right.
and they billed for the 10 cc vial. So the plan was supposed to, they were asking the plan to pay for the entire vial when they only used half a cc. So that's waste. That's what they're
Right.
talking about. There are multiple problems to it, multiple complications to it, and we'll certainly talk about that. But that in general is what they're talking about.
Right. Right. Well, in regards to the more problematic uses of the term waste, how big of a problem is it?
It's hard to tell.
Right.
Number one, and we're heavily involved with it in, for example, in our J code that is used by a lot of people across the country in pricing of drugs, our analyses where we identify the amount that was used, the amount that was wasted, and how much is that worth so that people can pay a physician or infusion center or hospital or whatever for the wastage.
Right.
However, the issue here is that it's not quite that simple. And I know it's easy to point the finger and say it's a drug company or it's somebody else, and I
Right.
understand that, and some of that is probably true. But the real issue here is that there are states that require that if a vial is used, usually as a single dose vial, that the state will pay for the entire vial, or they mandate that. Drugs come either in a standard quantity that is usually the typical dose that would be administered, or they give them in what is known as single use or unit of use doses to try and take a large vial, put it down into a smaller vial or a smaller syringe in order to give that. Now, there are problems with that. If someone leaves a little bit of air in the thing, so you have to aspirate it to get the air out. There are new rules, federal rules, as well as certain state rules, that becomes a problem potentially to a nurse or somebody where they could be affected if they got pregnant and they were aspirating and throwing toxic drugs like chemotherapy or something into the air. So there's issues about that that have to deal with regulatory issues that you can't wave away and just say that it's a drug company's problem or somebody
Right.
else's problem. It's a general problem. But bottom line is, if the drug is administered and they're administering the amount in the vial that is typically not based on body weight, then that's the whole vial and they're administering it, there is no waste.
Right.
In the cases where there is body weight or there could be a child dose versus an adult dose, etc., and they aren't packaged differently or labeled differently,
Okay.
then yes, there could be waste in that regard.
Right.
And it's hard to tell. There may be more in a children's hospital than there is in an adult hospital. There could be problems clearly in an ICU or in a intensive or in a cancer chemotherapy ward. So there could be more of that. Typically, you don't see a lot of waste, but those areas could have waste and could be a real problem.
Speaking on that, could you have maybe an expected waste? Like we know that there are drugs that are, as you said, administered through based on the patient's body weight or patient's ability to take the drug in, meaning how they're reacting to it. Could you have an expected waste where you're like, where you're saying, kind of like focusing on where the problems might be in regards to waste?
Not usually. Not
But,
usually.
to
If there
avoid
was,
contamination. I know
yeah.
you want to avoid
If
those kind.
if there was, then it would be packaged differently.
Right.
Now, what happens with pharmaceutical manufacturers is that the argument, as I understand it, is that they put it in a whatever 10 cc or 100 cc vial because of the idea that they thought they were going to sell more.
Right.
Hospitals are acutely aware of the wastage of what goes on because they buy it for a given amount, and if they've only given a fraction of it and the state or the federal government is only going to pay them for the amount that they gave, they're acutely aware of what that wastage.
Right.
In some places, and certainly under Medicare, they can be paid under certain J codes for that. So it becomes a billing matter more than it is a wastage matter. The other part of it is that if, for example, you use that 10 cc vial that I alluded to before, that's say influenza vaccine, and someone pulls up a 0.5 cc dose to give to an individual. If they're going to give other doses to other individuals, which they easily could, it's not a problem.
Right.
They have to change the syringe, they have to change the needle, and then redo it with aseptic technique in order to address it. So you are adding a cost and an issue there because you are taking multiple doses out of it, but each time you have to change the syringe, you have to change the needle, so you're not using the same one and then disposing of it in appropriate ways to deal with that. The other part of this is that there may be issues where everybody is colluding to it, meaning people who are billing for it are billing for a larger amount, which happens frequently, and now people are more sensitive to that and are only paying for the amount that was given. There may be issues with regard to the packaging and the way that it was packaged, although typically that is not the huge problem. It may be with some drugs, heparin, potassium, and all of those, but those are not hugely expensive drugs. So if they are, there may be a wastage problem, but it's not.
It's very minimal.
It's not like it's a big cost for a drug that costs $80,000 and now you're wasting half of it or something like that.
Yeah.
And then the other part of this is that there may be issues with regard to aseptic technique, and we've seen that already, where there are companies that are doing repackaging of drugs, where they take a big vial and they put it into syringes, and they put it into smaller unit of use vials.
Okay.
People got into trouble with that a couple of years ago in Massachusetts, where they repackaged. It wasn't done under sterile technique. It was sterile water, and as a result of that, people got meningitis, things like that. So there is a need to follow fundamental techniques, and you alluded to it, and I'll address the fact that yes, I've made thousands of IVs in my lifetime, but probably tens or hundreds of thousands. But bottom line is, if you follow the rules, you don't get into trouble. I never got into trouble. This isn't an ego contest. It's you follow the rules. You follow the rules for aseptic technique and you don't have problems.
Yeah.
If you don't, you do, and people get hurt, and seriously. So there is a professional etiquette, aside from everything else, that you do things right to make sure that you don't harm people. Now, is there a problem with waste in those regards? There probably is in what they do, but the whole idea of repackaging to a smaller amount was to try and get away from some of this wastage problem, in order to do it with more unit of use type areas. So that may but implicitly indicate that there is a wastage issue, but then the whole idea was to do packaging in order to try and avoid it.
Yeah, there's a wastage issue, but some waste is necessary for safety reasons.
Yes.
Yeah. Good rule of thumb. Follow the rules. As far as the more problematic, I want to stick to more the problems and wastage rather than necessary ones. In regards to the problem side, is this more of a manufacturer problem, a provider problem, a patient problem? Where can we put our focus as to where the problems lie?
I know that the media or social media, that the staff has found it's identified and pointed the finger at pharma, and there may be some of that, but I don't really think that that's a primary motivation. The motivation and the numbers, I mean, clearly there are commercial interests. But the ideas and the motivation are selling the number of units, the number of vials, the number of bags, the number of tablets or whatever. It's not based on the fact that you waste half of it or otherwise because you bought the whole thing. So yes, there probably is something to that, but just pointing the finger at pharma, I think, is being too simplistic. Pointing the finger at providers and saying, well, what did you do? You billed for it wrong because you were trying to get paid more than what goes on. Yeah, that's pretty common. But payers have gotten more sophisticated at looking at that and trying to see it. That's one of the reasons why they use tools like ours, et cetera, because they want to make sure that they're not allowing for paying for a whole box of something when only one vial was used or something like that.
Utilizing analytics.
Absolutely. And then the third issue is in nurses and pharmacists and doctors and others who are administering it. They don't like to leave a lot either. Why? Because the wastage problem becomes a real big problem in any facility where you've got to keep all of these red big plastic things, etc., in order to try and deal with whatever the wastage is. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Doesn't mean that there isn't a lot that's involved. But if you've been in any of these facilities, there are whole areas that are just bags and bags and bags of these things. So nobody is trying to come up with more ways to waste it. If you can do it, you do. That doesn't mitigate that some people may have used some of these drugs that may be opiates or analgesics or anesthetics, and they've taken them out and used them for other purposes. That's illegal. But
back to follow the rules.
Yes, back to following the rules as you try and control it so that you can try and make sure that everything is done. So it's a multifactorial problem. Yes, you can point at one, you can point at the other, you can point at the other, and yeah, you're probably right in each one. But this is an area where you're trying to simplify a problem that is much more complicated than just trying to pass off the buck.
And it's really centered around what your goals are. Like, what's the end result? Are you trying to lower drug prices? That's probably where you're going to point the finger at manufacturers, pharmacies, that kind of thing. If you're trying to stop with all the just throwing away extra drugs, you're probably going to point at pharmacies or maybe just patients in general. So say our end goal is to lower drug prices in that. What can be done about that?
Well, let's look at it from an ambulatory setting as well as from an institutional setting like a hospital. From an ambulatory setting, if you get a prescription typically for common stuff, high blood pressure, diabetes, hyperlipidemia or high cholesterol, things like that.
Right.
You need to take the entire drug. You can't just take it, not take part of it, etc.
Okay.
Decreasing the drug cost has more to do with asking, is there a generic available? Is there a less costly brand available that will do the same thing?
Mm-hmm.
And in most of these cases, there are 10, 12 other options or whatever it is that you can look at that are less costly perhaps than the one that you have. And if you have the lowest cost one, then fine, just take the entire prescription.
Right.
In areas where you have pain medicine or opiates, where you have antibiotics, where you have sedative hypnotics, things like that, you want the smallest amount possible to deal with the problem. And one of the big issues with opiates now is that people are given, for example, a 30-day or 60-day or 90-day supply of something when they're only going to use it for a few days.
Right.
So typically, if you want to lower the cost, the way to do that is to give it for the 2 or 3 days for which you need it, and then the pain and acute pain management begins to dissipate, and your problem can be handled with over-the-counter Tylenol or acetaminophen, aspirin, stuff like that.
Okay.
That's one thing to do. Second is when you get a prescription, if it's new,
Mm-hmm.
then ask for just a week or 2 weeks supply so that you can make sure you tolerate it. Because many of these drugs you take, but then you find out that you have an adverse effect or you can't tolerate the drug, so you've wasted all the rest of this drug, but the drug was paid for. Yes, there may be considerations where you have to pay another copay and the rest, but you should be working with your pharmacist about that to say, look, it's new for me. I don't know whether I'm going to tolerate it. Give me a week, give me 2 weeks, let me try it out, see if this is. And then, given that I tolerate it, then get the rest of it and then follow up. And the doctor should be helping in what they're prescribing. Those are two obvious ways to handle ambulatory therapy.
Are there guidelines for that?
No, that's a professional thing that is done. It's done by physicians, done by pharmacists, in trying to limit and make sure in a clinical way to make sure that people aren't just throwing drugs out there, but you're following to make sure that they're using them.
Right.
The third thing that can be done is that if you have pain management, in most cases, if it's chronic non-malignant, meaning it's not cancer pain, then there is a limit to the pain, and there should be multiple other options. The doctor should be looking at it to identify why are you using this for an extended period of time.
Right.
Typically, if it's being used for a very acute phase, even after a surgery, you need opiates perhaps for 3-4 days. And after that, then you can switch to other meds in order to try and control it. So this issue of just getting a lot of medication just to have a lot of medication is not terribly useful. If people are using it and selling it, that's something else, and that clearly is illegal.
Right.
But the option here is to limit the amount of drugs you need, and that's true of sedative hypnotics, it's true of opiates, it's true of other pain management, etc. Now, if you have a legitimate, pardon me, a legitimate problem, like rheumatoid arthritis or osteoarthritis or whatever, clearly you're going to be taking it on a regular basis. And it's terribly important that you take it on a scheduled basis. You need to build up levels of these drugs in the blood so that you're getting a constant effect. If you take it first, then stop, then first, then stop, first, then stop, you don't get a steady state level. And as a result of that, you have breakthrough pain, and then you're complaining that the drug doesn't work or otherwise.
Right.
On a hospital side, on an institutional side, that's where the emphasis is. Which drugs are we wasting? And the people that are doing it, the nurses, the pharmacists, doctors, see where they're wasting it. And that's where you want to go, and you want to make sure the hospital or its contract facility or otherwise is pre-packing it in a sterile way so that you're not wasting a whole bag or a whole box or a whole vial or otherwise, but you have it down to a unit of use type of process. And finally, there are, or maybe not finally, I'm sure there's a lot of other things to talk about as well, but Many manufacturers, especially on the diabetic side, have come up with syringe systems where you can dial the amount that you want to give to someone.
Right, right. I've seen
So
those.
you are giving them a certain amount, but it has a much larger quantity, but it can be reused. So you've dialed to give just the amount, and then the amount is still there. Now, clearly, you need to change the needle, etc., so that you're following aseptic technique.
Uh-huh.
But these are techniques to try and deal with where you wouldn't take the complete amount and you would only take a partial amount. And who knows, there may be issues like that that will be developed in cancer chemotherapy and others where some of this would be wasted and they come up with similar kind of dosage techniques that they have in diabetes syringes, things like
Right.
that.
One would hope. One would hope
One would
that.
hope. One would hope.
But as medicine continues to advance, and that as we keep talking about subjects like this, communicating with your doctor is always one of the most important things. Like they can avoid wastage just by communicating, like pain symptoms, as you talked about with opiates, and perhaps a guideline for prescribing these medications might also help. Um,
Well,
get
there
rid
are,
of these problems.
I apologize for
Uh huh.
interrupting, Alex.
Go for it.
The CDC has come up with guidelines for administering or prescribing drugs for opiates specifically
Right.
because of the whole opiate issue that has
Yeah.
come up.
Recently, I've
And
seen that.
recently,
Yeah.
so there are guidelines for that.
Mm.
There are also guidelines in general for how you treat bacterial infections. And as a follow-up to it, there are things that are called antibiotic stewardship programs that have made a big impact on inpatient facilities.
Right.
And some people are doing it on outpatient. We're certainly doing it in our DUR, drug utilization review, and things that we do. Bottom line point is, there are certain guidelines and certain oversight that is going on that is much greater than just utilization review. But at the end of the day,
Yeah.
you're trying to make sure that drugs are being used appropriately, because when they're misused, that's when you have problems. That's when people end up in hospitals. That's when people get sick. Sometimes people die.
Yeah. Well, don't want to end on a somber note, but that's our topic for today. Just if you have any comments, or please feel free to comment below, and please visit propharmaconsultants.com. We have a free information page called RxInfoX, and as Dr. Stern mentioned, he has written many articles regarding antibiotic stewardship and many others. Please feel free to visit. We have a pharmacy benefit news page, which we have, I believe it's every 2 weeks, right? Every 2 weeks is a new article. And we will see you next week for Halloween.